Hi, I'm Neale Morison of the Data Standards Body, or DSB. I'm speaking to James Bligh of the Data Standards Body. James is lead architect of the Consumer Data Standards, which are an integral part of the Consumer Data Right, or CDR. I'll be asking James some questions, and we hope his answers will provide an introduction to the Consumer Data Standards. So first, James, before we get to the Consumer Data Standards, can you provide us with a little background on the Consumer Data Right?
So the CDR, or Consumer Data Right, is a government initiative to establish a regime where a consumer, the C in Consumer Data Right, is able to have the data about them held by certain institutions like banks and energy companies, etc., transferred to another organisation according to the requirements of the consumer. So the consumer desires this data to be transferred so that they'll get some benefit or service, and so they request that to be moved. So the regime is a set of rules, legislation, standards, etc. that facilitate that data transfer at the behest of the consumer for their own benefit.
Why are there so many acronyms in the Consumer Data Right?
So I often hear in the Consumer Data Right, or CDR, that there are too many acronyms. And this is true. And the reason we have so many acronyms is the same reason you get lots of acronyms in any other area, like medicine or technology in general, or even government departments. It's because you end up with these very long, very specific names that have to be reused over and over and over again, and people get sick of saying them, so they come up with acronyms for them. Unfortunately, it makes it really hard for new people who aren't involved in the regime to come in and figure out these magical words that everybody is saying. But things like OIDC, OpenID Connect, which is a long way of saying the technology we use for information security, or the ACCC, the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, if I get those C's in the right order, which is the name of the agency that is regulating, or even the DSB, the Data Standards Body, or the CDR itself, Consumer Data Right. People involved in these regimes use these terms over and over again, and they get sick of it. Even down to something as simple as a decision proposal gets truncated to just DP. It happens all the time, and it does make it hard for people to come into the regime. So we do try hard to explain what all these things mean when people have questions.
Who is participating in the CDR?
There are three different groups of people or organisations participating in the Consumer Data Right. The first are the organisations that are compelled to participate, the organisations that hold the data, or data holders. These are the organisations that are designated, so they now have a compliance obligation that they have to make the data available for sharing. So they participate under requirement of regulation. The next group of that participate in the Consumer Data Right are the accredited data recipients. So these are the people who run companies, fintechs, energy techs, small applications, or large organisations where obtaining data from the Consumer Data Right will add value to a consumer. So they're actually offering a service where the data is going to make their service better and more useful and more valuable. And so they voluntarily participate because it will enhance their service and therefore enhance the consumer's experience. And the final group participating in the Consumer Data Right is obviously the consumer. And that's what it's all about. The Consumer Data Right is designed to help consumers. If the services don't add value to consumers, they are not required to share the data, and therefore they won't. So a consumer is, if you like, the ultimate participant in the Consumer Data Right.
When will the CDR be available?
Because people haven't heard of the Consumer Data Right, and when I describe it to them, they often say to me, "Oh, when is this going to happen?" And the answer to that is it's already here. It already exists. Every bank in Australia, every authorised deposit-taking institution, every company with a banking licence is already implemented and sharing data under the Consumer Data Right and is regulated to do so. The energy sector has just started in November 2022. The first energy data holder went online with multiple scheduled to come over the next 6 to 12 months and more features coming out. So the energy sector is also now active, with other sectors coming later. But the consumer data right is not something in the future. It is already in existence. It is already operating. And at the last count, there was the last stats that I saw, which is now at least a month or two old, where there had already been more than 100 million API invocations under the consumer data right. And each one of those invocations is, in its own right, a data sharing event. So that's over 100 million data sharing events that has already occurred.
Where do I find the ADR apps so I can use the CDR?
If you are looking for an organisation that actually uses the CDR, that takes advantage of the CDR, you can find that on a website managed by the ACCC, cdr.gov.au. There is a provider directory on there, and going in there you can see not only the people that share data, the data holders, but you can also see a list of all the data recipients that have been accredited as well. However, in general, we don't expect people to look for ADRs or people using the CDR. We expect people to want their services, and then when they use their services, they happen to use the CDR to deliver those services. Ideally, the CDR should be like electricity, something that everybody uses all the time and gets a lot of value from, but not something everybody thinks about. When you turn the light switch on, you don't think, electricity from my energy retailer. You think, I want light. And that's what CDR should be about. It should be the rails. It should not be something that people actively engage in, except to understand that their data is being transferred with trust and security.
How do we use the CDR?
Ideally, people shouldn't consider themselves to be using the consumer data right. They should use a service that happens to use the consumer data right. Personally, my desire is to see the consumer data rights being seen as something that is just in the background. It's like electricity or cell towers that is just there for us. The internet, for instance, people don't think about connecting to 4G. It just happens with their phone. In fact, when it doesn't happen, that's when they start to realise it's there and there's a problem. So hopefully people won't use the consumer data right. What they will do, however, is see the consistent consent screens. Every time they're asked to share data, it should look the same way, it'll be the same form, and that in itself is a protection, because consistency and repetition means people can identify patterns, so that when things don't work exactly the same way, they can say there's some problem here, and then they can maybe investigate that. But apart from the consent screens and the revocation, people don't even need to know they're using the consumer data right.
What parts of government are involved in the consumer data right?
So the consumer data right is governed by co-regulators, the ACCC and the OIAC. So that's the Office of the Privacy Commissioner and the Competition Authority, and they're the regulators. So they're obviously heavily involved. The Treasury, the Federal Treasury for the federal government, is the other agency that's heavily involved, and the data standards body that sets the technical standards sits under the Treasury. Now they are all involved, but they're not involved in the actual data sharing. They're involved in regulating, setting the rules of the road, making sure the regime's established, and holding people to account if they behave badly. But when data is actually shared, it never goes to the government. The data, if it's shared from a bank to a fintech, will go from a bank to the fintech, and it doesn't go through a central government agency or database. In fact, the government never receives data under the CDR in its current form.
Why do we have the consumer data standards?
So the standards under the consumer data right are really important for ensuring consistency. There are over 100 different banks in Australia. There are nearly as many energy retailers. There are many telecommunications companies. As the consumer data right expands and rolls out, the idea that fintechs, energy techs, these sorts of startups can talk to literally hundreds of organisations, if all of those organisations were building systems differently, it would be impossible. So the analogy that I like to use is the standards are like the PowerPoints in your house. Imagine if every house had a different configuration of PowerPoint. And so when you went to JB Hi-Fi or The Good Guys or something like this and you wanted to buy a toaster, you had to figure out what sort of plug it was and whether that plug would work in your house. And if you then gave that toaster to a friend, it wouldn't work in their house. We don't think about that. We buy the toaster, we plug it in. And the reason we can do that is because every PowerPoint in Australia is standardised. The Consumer Data Standards does the same thing. It means that no matter who I connect to under the consumer data right, I'll be connecting the same way. And those standards ensure that commonality and consistency.
How do the consumer data standards protect my data?
There are two major aspects of the consumer data standards that are there to reduce the risk of data sharing and to protect people's data. The first is what's called the Information Security Profile. And the Information Security Profile is a set of controls, encryption standards, communication standards, mechanisms for authentication and authorization that make the regime secure. When you hear on the news about information security breaches, it's usually failures in processes like that that allowed that breach to occur. And a lot of time is spent in the consumer data standards ensuring that the information security profile is world's best practice and built on international standards. The other aspect that protects consumers are the consumer experience guidelines and standards. And they effectively define a set of flows so that everybody who shares data under the consumer data right does it consistently and so it looks the same. One of the ways people can be protected is if they see the same flow every time, then they get a sort of a muscle memory around this is how I expect to share data. And then if somebody doesn't do it that way, they skip a step, it's a bit like when you get a spam call or someone trying to scam you. You tend to sense this isn't right, this isn't the way companies normally interact with me, and that's a protection in and of itself.
How will the consumer data standards change and evolve?
So the standards change and evolve for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is because new sectors get designated. The government says now we're doing energy, now we're doing telecommunication, and that requires changes to occur. Another reason the standards evolve is because we learn. We just thought this would be a good thing to do in the standards, and then we realised actually it wasn't as good as we thought, and there's a better way of doing it. And another reason is because the industry moves. There's new international standards developed, and we want to absorb them, take advantage of them, and so on and so forth. It's the same reasons that a lot of technical solutions evolve. We knew at the outset that the standards would need to evolve, that we wouldn't just be perfect the first time, and that they would never have to change. So we actually implemented within the process by which we define the standards and how the standards are used, we included change management and version management. So it means that when a new API is modified, we can actually have that as a new version, and then some people can implement that and some haven't, and some can call the new version while some can call the old version. So we can actually manage the phasing in of change over time. And there's a lot of different ways we manage that.
Can the consumer data standards be hacked?
Anything can be hacked. It's just the way of the world. Anything can be hacked. Now that said, not everything does get hacked, and the way you prevent people being a target for hacking or even being susceptible to hacking is through risk management, controls, mitigations, steps that you take to authenticate effectively and properly. And they can mitigate against the more egregious forms of hacking and even eliminate hacking because it's just not worth the effort to try and hack your system. Now the reality is that for the last 4.5 years we have implemented for the consumer data right information security protocols and controls based on industry best practice protocols and standards that are global and highly tested. And we continually get external reviews of the standards in the consumer data right. We have every security department of every bank in Australia reviewing them continuously and highlighting issues that they observe. And we spend a lot of time reviewing what's occurring in the InfoSec environment and cybersecurity practice to ensure that we've got the highest level of security for the data transfer. As a result, I have a high degree of confidence in the level of security we implement for the data sharing process in the consumer data right, to the point where if you were trying to hack the data available in the consumer data right, you would actually be better off trying to hack it where it currently is inside organisations. which is actually a more susceptible environment in most cases. Now that said, bad things can happen, and we try and avoid that as much as possible. When people say to me, I'm sharing data in the consumer data right, how do I keep myself safe? How do I ensure that my data is protected? The key thing I usually say in response to that is that sharing data is a trade-off. If you share your data, you'll get value from it. Someone will use it for an algorithm, you'll help you apply for a loan, they'll help you get a credit card, they'll use it for comparison, etc., and you'll get that benefit, but you expose yourself to risk. This is literally no different to using a social media platform like Facebook or TikTok. By doing that, you are giving something up, but you're getting value in return. That said, to keep yourself safe in the consumer data right, I usually recommend two things. One is be careful who you share with. Make sure that it's an organisation that you actually want the service from and that they're reputable. Now, under the consumer data right, the mere fact that they're accredited data recipients means that they're reputable to a certain base level standard. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're someone you personally want to share data with. And also, you should look at the purpose that they will use the data for. Under the consumer data right, they have to be very explicit to what they will do with your data and how they will use it. If you're not happy with what they say, don't share your data. The other way to be really secure when sharing data, particularly financial data with a fintech or an app or something like that, is never ever give up your password. Under the consumer data right, if it's truly the consumer data right, if it's truly sharing through the consumer data right, you will not be asked for your bank's internet banking password, and you should never ever give anyone, even a family member, your internet banking password. Most banks have mechanisms by which they can share information and let somebody else access bank accounts for particular purposes, and they should be used. You shouldn't be sharing your password.
Where can I find out more about the consumer data standards?
If you're interested in finding out more about the consumer data standards, I would advise you to go to consumerdatastandards.gov.au. That website is the website for the data standards body, and it has links to the standards themselves. It also has links to a whole lot of other resources, such as the GitHub repositories, where we actually consult on changing the standards and actually do change the standards. And it also has links to the consumer experience guidelines and artifacts, things like mock-ups of screens for various aspects of the consumer data standards, and you can go and have a look at those as well.
I've been speaking to James Bligh of the Data Standards Body, lead architect of the Consumer Data Standards. Thank you very much, James, for answering our questions. And thank you for participating in the Consumer Data Right.